The Untold Story of a Serial Killer on Cape Cod is a true crime book written by Casey Sherman, focusing on the case of Tony Costa and the murders of Patricia Walsh and Marianne Wysocki. Casey Sherman is a New York Times, USA Today, and Wall Street Journal best-selling American author, journalist, and screenwriter, most famous for his 2009 book The Finest Hours, which was adapted into a 2016 film of the same name, and Boston Strong, which was adapted into the 2016 film Patriot Day. I am Teresa, and welcome to Canvas and Crime Chronicles. As for Sherman, the first investigation he was ever a part of was the Boston Strangler case, and that's because his aunt, Mary Sullivan, was the youngest and final victim of that 1960s murder spree committed by Albert DeSalvo. In Helltown, and like with Ann Rule, Casey Sherman has taken great pains to highlight the lives of the victims, Patricia and Marianne. Because of his aunt and his understanding of what a family goes through, he wanted the victims of his story to be fully developed people and not just there for Tony Costa's amusement. He wanted to show how these were women with hopes and dreams. They were daughters, they were sisters, and they were best friends. Their murders affected so many people, he wanted to make sure that wasn't lost in the writing of Helltown. In 1969, the Summer of Love is a distant memory. The Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King assassinations were fresh in America's mind, and the DNC protests in Chicago, the inauguration of Nixon, the moon landing, Chappaquiddick, and then the final exclamation point of the Manson murders all loomed. 1969 was such a crazy year in American history. So much happened during that time that ultimately, Tony Costa's crimes were forgotten and overshadowed by other events. I had never even heard of Helltown or Tony Costa until I read Casey Sherman's book. By the late 1960s, the hippie scene in Provincetown, Massachusetts was in full swing, and at the center of it all was a 24-year-old divorced carpenter by the name of Tony Costa. Known as Sire by his large following of admiring young women that hung around him, Costa's good looks and charisma initially protected him from suspicion when a number of girls started disappearing in May of 1968. However, Costa's luck would not only last so long. It all began with the disappearance of Sydney Monzon, who was last seen alive by her sister getting into a car with Costa. Monzon vanished without a trace. Although young people disappearing in the area wasn't uncommon at the time, the 18-year-old was among 19 teenagers to disappear from Provincetown in 1968. The town was considered very transient, and it was believed that Monzon had likely joined a caravan of teens to embark on a drug-fueled trip to either California or Mexico. But on February 8, 1969, a search was organized for two missing women, Patricia Walsh and Marianne Wysocki. This was launched at a woods where Walsh's Volkswagen had been abandoned. Patricia and Marianne had been to Provincetown, Massachusetts in the summertime when the streets were teeming with family vacationers and hippies. The following January, they returned to the Cape Cod during a quiet winter weekend. Marianne Wysocki, a college student, and Patricia Walsh, a teacher, both 23 at the time, checked into a guest house run by Patricia Morton. This is where they met Tony Costa, an unemployed handyman, amateur taxidermist, and divorced father of three, who was also staying at Mrs. Morton's boarding house. That night, they visited 3 Provincetown bars, and the next day they disappeared. Tony was last seen driving Patricia's light blue Volkswagen after their disappearance, and was also found to have the girls' personal belongings in his room at Mrs. Morton's guest house. The girls supposedly checked out on Sunday morning, leaving a note on their door, and were never seen alive again. When they failed to return to their homes in Providence, Rhode Island, their parents contacted police and an APB went out. Oddly enough, during the search, police discovered the remains of Susan Perry, who had been missing since the previous September. Perry's body had been cut into 8 pieces. This reminded me of Shannon Gilbert and her missing woman case, and the investigation would brought to light so many killings from the Gilgo Beach murders and the Long Island serial killer, that one other child or one other teen's disappearance would lead to many other more bodies and clues and a larger investigation. A routine entry in the Truro police blotter led to the first discovery. It read, "Out of gas." Checking out a resident's complaint, Police Chief Harold Berrio found an abandoned Volkswagen parked in a lonely wooded area known locally as a lover's lane. On the windshield was a handwritten note explaining that the driver had run out of gas and would return. A few days later, the story of the two missing girls came out and gave the registration number of their car. It matched the number that Police Chief Harold Berrio had recorded. The car belonged to Patricia Walsh, but when Truro police went back to look for it, the VW was gone. Soon after, police in the tiny town of Truro, a small town only 8 miles from Provincetown, began probing the ground near where the car had been parked. At the first grave, they found a head wrapped in a plastic bag and found the mutilated remains of an unidentified teenage girl buried in a shallow grave. There were apparent stab wounds, and she was swathed in a cloth. Then about 300 yards away, they uncovered the 2 Providence girls and another unidentified stranger. All were similarly butchered. It seemed that the girls had been killed before dismemberment and were later identified as Susan Perry and Sidney Monzon. An axe or something similar had been used for the mutilations. All apparently were naked at death, and there were teeth marks on their bodies. An autopsy showed that the 2 teenagers' bodies had been buried for at least 8 or 9 months. One of the Providence girls had apparently tried to run away, and the police found her handbag not far from where she was found. About a month later, parts of Wisaki's body were found. Then Walsh and the rest of the Wisaki body were found in a forest clearing. Patricia and Marianne had also been mutilated with a knife and apparently died of gunshot wounds to the head. Beneath these remains, police found the dismembered body of the 4th victim, Sidney Monzon. In Burlington, Vermont, police spotted the missing blue Volkswagen in a local garage. The owner said that it had been left by a man named Costa, who told him that he needed to park it there for a month. When police questioned Tony Costa about the car, he showed a bill of sale supposedly drawn up by Patricia Walsh. Police knew that the clearing where the bodies were found was used by Costa for growing marijuana, making him their main suspect. Costa knew the 4 women who had all disappeared following his return to Truro, and his fingerprints were on the torn cover of the Volkswagen's owner manual, which was found in the woods. The case gained international attention when District Attorney Edmund Dennis made in comments to the media. Dennis was extremely graphic in his statement and comments and gave away many facts as well as many embellishments. These claims drew national attention and international media outlets to Provincetown, Massachusetts. The drug landscape at the time of the woman's murders influenced how the police investigated this case, because in 1969, Provincetown and many other areas like Greenwich Village in New York and San Francisco were transient areas for hippies to live and cultivate their lifestyles. So when these young women turned up missing, the police really didn't take it too seriously because they thought that these kids were just getting into VW buses and traveling the country, because that's what young people did at the time. Had these murders taken place in 2020, 22, or 2023, I think investigators would have jumped on it right away, as opposed to taking weeks and even months to investigate these disappearances. Tony Costa was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts on August 2, 1944, during World War II. He committed his first violent offense in November 1961 at the age of 17, when he broke into a neighbor's house and attacked a teenage girl. He was charged with burglary and assault and sentenced to only 3 years probation and 1 year suspended sentence. Costa was married in 1963 to a 14-year-old girl, and together they had 3 children. It was around this point that he began to use drugs heavily, such as marijuana and LSD, and the marriage dissolved over his drug use, and he moved to California in 1966. In the summer of 1968, Costa returned to Massachusetts. Tony Costa was the ultimate chameleon. His greatest strength as a criminal was his charm, so he wormed his way into the Provincetown Police Department and got access to some of the investigators, especially when they started to really focus on the disappearances of Mary Ann Wisaki and Patricia Walsh. Meanwhile, he also used his charm to access drugs and meet young women. Costa was able to keep his finger on parts of the investigation while he openly baited the police into a cat-and-mouse game because he thought he was smarter than they all were, and he was continuing to lure women to their deaths. The police kept Tony under surveillance. A few weeks later, Tony was arrested in Boston and taken to Provincetown District Court, where he pleaded innocent to the charges of murdering the 2 Rhode Island girls. He was then sent for observation to the state hospital at Bridgewater, Massachusetts. As a side note, Kurt Vonnegut, whose daughter Edith had also met Costa and also lived in Provincetown, was acquainted with Costa. Vonnegut compared Costa to Jack the Ripper in an article in July 25, 1969 issue of Life magazine, which was included in a collection of essays he wrote. But Vonnegut also maintained a correspondence with Costa and believed that he could not possibly have hurt a fly. In addition to the deaths of the 4 women, Costa was suspected of killing 2 young women, Bonnie Williams and Diane Furteroff, who he had offered to drive from Pennsylvania to California in 1966. During his time in California, police also believe he murdered his girlfriend, Barbara Spaulding, in 1968. Costa's 8th victim is believed to be Christine Gallant, who was killed on November 23, 1968, in her New York City apartment. The serial killer, however, was only tried for the deaths of Walsh and Wysocki. He maintained his innocence in all of the killings, blaming the crimes on both real-life acquaintances and on an evil alter ego he called Corey. On June 12, 1969, Costa was arraigned on charges of murder for the 2 deaths. In May 1970, he was convicted of the murders of Wysocki and Walsh and sentenced to life in prison at Massachusetts Walpole Correctional Institution. On May 12, 1974, he hung himself in jail after having only served 4 years. He was 29 years old. While his death was ruled a suicide, some experts believe Costa was actually murdered by a group of fellow inmates. While in prison, Costa wrote a book called Resurrection. In it, he described the murders of Walsh and Wysocki and said that they were murdered by a pseudonym named Carl. Costa and a friend, identified as Carl, had been consuming LSD and Dilaudid with the 2 women. Then Costa claims that Carl shot Walsh and Wysocki. Costa claimed he was able to subdue his friend, and upon realizing that Wysocki was still alive, used a knife to end her suffering. According to Costa, he and Carl then buried the bodies. The novel also described the deaths of Susan Perry and Sidney Monzon as being due to drug overdoses. Costa claims it was Carl who dismembered and buried their bodies, and that he had no knowledge of it until after their deaths. Thank you to listening for another episode of Canvas and Crimes. If there's a story you'd like to look into and recap, drop it in the comments. I avoid over-sensationalized serial killers and the overly popular stories, but feel free to offer suggestions. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.